Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute for today's Small Biz Hangout. I'm Jennifer Shee, the Small Business Coordinator and Program Director at the NHLBI, and I'll be moderating today's session to demystify small business review at the NIH and NHLBI. So we have two expert presenters here today, Dr. Margaret Chandler from the NIH Center for Scientific Review and Dr. Kristen Goldtree from the NHLBI Office of Scientific Review. And we're going to go over a few housekeeping items first. So a brief disclaimer that we present these Hangouts for educational purposes, and they're not meant to be guidance for a particular project or technology. Also, all the information provided is current for today, though it's always possible that policies change in the future. If you're developing something that is within the scope of the NHLBI mission, please contact us for additional guidance. If you're working outside the scope of our mission, the information that we talk about here today will still be relevant, but we encourage you to reach out to a program official at the appropriate institute to discuss the specifics of your project. And you can learn more about who to contact at the NIH SBIR website, which is in that URL below. So a few housekeeping items. If you're having trouble with the video presentation, just try leaving and rejoining the event. Hopefully you can actually hear or see what I'm just saying. There are multiple ways to join the audio portion for today's event. You can listen directly from your computer, or if you're having difficulties because sometimes the audio from the computer is less robust than dialing in from the phone, you can have the event actually call you using the Call Me icon on your screen and entering in your phone number, or you can just call in using the telephone number and event number that's in your registration confirmation and also listed here and below and in the next few slides. All participants are going to remain muted throughout the entire webinar, but you can submit questions anytime through the Q&A panel on your screen. If you're viewing the event in full screen mode, you can hover over the small green bar at the top of your screen to get to the Q&A panel. Your questions will only be seen by the organizers, and no other audience members are going to be able to see them. We may get multiple similar questions, and if that happens, we may rephrase the question or answer them with a single answer. So just be aware you may not hear the exact phrasing when your question is asked and answered. You can type in questions at any point during the event, and we'll stop periodically to answer them. Due to the general nature of this presentation, any questions that are specific to your project or a particular technology are not going to be addressed, but we do encourage you to reach out and ask those questions, and we can set up a time to speak more specifically. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to YouTube along with all of our other archived Small Biz Hangouts. And slides will be provided on request. So if you want a copy of today's slides, there's going to be a brief feedback form at the end of the webinar that you can put your email address in, or you can submit your request at this URL and select the Resources Inquiry option, and then you can select the reason Educational Resources. You can also actually just submit your request to talk about your specific project at that same URL if you want to talk about your technology and a possible application. So the Small Biz Hangouts are an educational series intended to provide biomedical innovators with information that will help you succeed in bringing your technology to market to improve human health. The information conveyed is not product specific and shouldn't be taken as a complete approach for any specific technology. The series covers many different topics, including regulatory matters that might be relevant to different technology types, understanding the market and customers for a product, developing and defending intellectual property, and issues related to getting coverage for a new technology. All of our Small Biz Hangouts are recorded, captioned, and posted to the NHLBI YouTube channel in a single playlist, which you can access at that URL, bit.ly/smallbizhangouts. To find out about our next Hangout, where to meet us in person, and other upcoming educational and funding opportunities, sign up for our mailing list at this URL, bit.ly/NHLBI-SBIR-updates. And we also try to send out information we think will be useful to our community around new FDA guidelines, other educational opportunities like an upcoming USPTO webinar, for example, and of course our own opportunities. So just one small bit about our office, which is the Office of Translational Alliances and Coordination. We coordinate the Small Business Innovation Research Small Business Technology Transfer programs for the NHLBI. And our team includes a regulatory and business development experts, as well as an entrepreneur in residence and investor in residence that help support our small business awardees, as well as academic innovators that might be taking part in some of the translational programs that NHLBI supports, including the NIH Centers for Accelerated Innovations and Research, Evaluation, and Commercialization Hubs. These are translational programs that support the early stages of transitioning a technology out of a university lab and onto the market. So as part of our support, we host these Small Biz Hangouts, and we also do a number of in-person outreach activities. So on to the main point of today's Hangout, and I'm just going to turn off our video for right now, but now you know what I look like. The main point of today's Hangout is, of course, demystifying small business review. So why should you care? Well, the scientific peer review process at NIH is core to evaluating your application and provides the basis for program staff to make fair funding decisions. Getting this type of feedback from a diverse group of peers can really help improve your research overall, leading to more robust development. And for you, understanding how this process works can help you write your own applications better and just understand what's actually happening with your application when it enters the big black box of government bureaucracy. So we'll be talking a lot about process today. Let's follow a bit where an application goes. So if you submit your SBIR or STTR application through grants.gov, where it then moves on to ERA, the NIH's electronic system. So from there, the first stop is at the NIH Center for Scientific Review in the Division of Receipt and Referral. They see about 75,000 to 80,000 applications a year. 9,000 of those are going to be SBIR, STTR applications, and they'll assign your application to be reviewed at a particular study section. They'll also assign your application to a particular institute for funding and administrative purposes. For review, that study section they refer you to may either be run by the NIH Center for Scientific Review, or it may be run by a similar group located in a specific institute. For the NHLBI, that is our Office of Scientific Review in our Division of Extramural Research Activities. And that's the topic of most of today's webinar, really. So whether the application is reviewed by CSR or by peer reviewers that are convened by the NHLBI, that information is provided by those peer reviewers to the information that's provided by the peer reviewers is going to be used by the institute to make the funding decisions. So how do you know if your application is being reviewed by a study section convened by CSR or by a particular institute? And really, does it matter? So first off, you can tell by reading the Funding Opportunity Announcement, or FOA. This is just an important thing you should do anyway for any application. There's critical information in there, like what do we want to actually see in your application? And of course, relevant to today's webinar, information about how your application is going to be reviewed. In Section 5, the application review information has the criteria by which your application will be evaluated. And Section 2 actually lists where your application is going to be reviewed. You can also generally tell from where the letter of intent is being sent, where the application is going to be reviewed. Just to note that while letters of intent are not required and they're not binding, they actually can help us prepare for review and make sure that we start recruiting the appropriate experts early. As a general rule, applications that are going to the investigator-initiated omnibus solicitation will be reviewed by the NIH Center for Scientific Review, and special targeted funding opportunities, such as RFAs or contracts, are reviewed by the NHLBI Office of Scientific Review. So the real reason why it matters where your application is being reviewed is really just because there are more likely to be special review criteria for the targeted funding opportunities and you really should know what those criteria are while you're writing your application. So again, read that funding opportunity announcement. And as a final note before I introduce our presenters, I want to encourage all of you to be part of the peer review process and submit your CV to be in that pool of potential peer reviewers. The system works because we can count on expertise from across the spectrum of researchers. At the NHLBI alone, we fund applications that cover therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, health IT technology, and they relate to heart, lung, blood, and sleep indications. So we need to be able to draw from a wide variety of expertise. For small business applications, we want people who understand how to evaluate commercial potential as well. And I'm sure that's something you also want. So with that, let me now introduce our presenters for the main event. Dr. Margaret Chandler serves as the Scientific Review Officer for the CSR Cardiovascular SBIR STTR Study Section. After receiving her master's from Dalhousie University, in Canada, in exercise physiology, and her PhD from Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine in cardiovascular physiology, she trained at Case Western Reserve University as a postdoc in the Department of Physiology and Biophysics. Before coming to the NIH, Dr. Chandler spent more than 10 years at Case Western as an NIH and American Heart Association-funded principal investigator, studying the role of cardiac energy metabolism in heart failure. And during that time, she served regularly as a reviewer for both the NIH and American Heart Association. She's been with the NIH Center for Scientific Review since 2013. Our second presenter, Dr. Kristen Goltry, has served as a Scientific Review Officer in the Division of Extramural Research Activities at the NHLBI since 2010. She received her PhD in cell biology from Northwestern University in 1991, and then spent 12 years as a principal scientist and program leader at Astrum Biosciences, developing autologous cell therapy products for clinical applications, where she was both a PI for SBIR awards as well as having served as a reviewer herself. So we're very lucky to have such experienced and dedicated scientific review officers with us today, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Chandler.
So thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everybody who is logged in to watch this webinar today. And I hope we can give you a little bit more information and help to, as the title says, demystify this process of review. So let me just start by saying, and some of the initial part of my presentation will actually duplicate or go over similar ground, but I'd like to put it in the context of myself acting as a scientific review officer within the Center for Scientific Review. And this is a really important distinction that we are trying to get our small business community, applicants and companies to really have an appreciation for what the distinction is between what goes on at the Center for Scientific Review and what goes on at the individual institutes. So when your application comes in to the NIH, there are literally two levels of review, or two levels of processing. The first is clearly the process of review that goes on within a scientific review group. Now, what's called the second level of review actually goes on at the institute, and that's really what happens in terms of funding decisions. Once applications have been reviewed that have actually been reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, they go to the institutes for those funding decisions by the institute officials as to what actually happens and whether or not your particular application is going to be ultimately funded. So just in terms of a timeline here, or a graphical line, from within the National Institutes of Health, the Center of Scientific Review is one of the core centers within the NIH. Now, in the Center for Scientific Review, we have multiple study sections where we review applications from not just small businesses, but all different types of scientific review groups. And then those reviews of the scientific merit of an application goes to the institutes for the funding decisions. Once it's at its individual institute, those discussions go on at the advisory council, and then it goes to the institute director for the final action in terms of an award. Now, just as a graphical, I wanted to be very clear that the Center for Scientific Review, where I function, is one of the three centers, but there are multiple institutes within the NIH. And in the green, you can clearly see my center, the Center for Scientific Review, and Jennifer's center, which is the NHLBI, which for my particular study section, given that it's the cardiovascular, SBIR, STTR, probably 95% of the applications that are reviewed in my particular study section are ultimately going to be considered for funding at NHLBI. That being said, it could be reviewed at any of the other institutes, depending on what your requests are for where you think the most appropriate institute is for funding the type of work that you are doing. So remember that in terms of when you're submitting your application, where do you think the most appropriate institute for funding is, as opposed to where necessarily you're going to be actually reviewed. Now, your application goes to the Center of Scientific Review, as all applications do, and this is the focal point for the initial review at NIH. Our mission at the Center for Scientific Review is to see that NIH grant applications receive fair, independent, expert, and timely reviews that are free from inappropriate influences so that the NIH can fund the most promising research. So CSR receives all NIH applications. They are referred to the institutes and center for review, and then we actually review the majority of grant applications for their scientific merit. Now, within the Center for Scientific Review, your application first goes for referral, and that's in the division for receipt and referral. This is a central receipt point for virtually all PHS grant applications. And this is where the institute and center assignment occurs, and this is also where it's assigned to a specific scientific review group or study section. Now, in terms of scientific review, we have approximately 240 chartered study sections, and within CSR there are 41 SBIR and STTR, what we call regular recurring special emphasis panels. So these SBIR study sections are often referred to as SEPs, and our sole mandate is to review your SBIR, STTR applications. Now, all grant applications are reviewed within the CSR study sections, but these particular 41 SBIR, STTR SEPs review all of the small business innovative research applications. Now, in terms of helping to get your application to the right study section, there are some very good web links within the Center for Scientific Review that will help you select the appropriate study section for your particular technology, device, or process. And it's really important for you to try to identify where you feel your application would get the most expert review. So look in CSR's website and find the study section which you feel is most appropriate for your particular science. Now, in terms of how is it going to get there, we now actually have an assignment request form, what's called an ARF. And this is a really important addition to your what's available to you to help get your application where it should be. And this ARF actually takes the place of what the traditional cover letter has usually done, and what it does is it allows you to make assignment requests, both in terms of the center where you want your application to be considered for funding, but also for the study section where you feel it would get the best review. You can also identify potential conflicts of interest on this form. And most importantly, from my perspective, in terms of the scientific review officer, if you want to help us out in the best way you possibly can, you can list what you consider the areas of expertise that are needed to best evaluate your application. Now, that form is outlined on this slide, and you can see where you can make requests for your IC assignment, and IC refers to institute or center. You can make a request for your specific review group assignment or study section and list 1, 2, or 3 options there of where you feel your application would get the best review. You can identify conflicts, and you can suggest expertise. And as I said, this is really important because you know your application and your topic better than anybody else. And by advising us as to where you feel the most appropriate expertise lies, then it's really helpful when it comes to our recruiting the appropriate reviewers and then making the appropriate assignments. Now, I did fail to say during that little discussion of the ARF, we do strongly recommend that you not make any recommendations for actual reviewers that you feel should review, because that is not necessarily going to be considered, because that would lend bias to the selection of potential reviewers. Now, in terms of the timetable, you all, I'm sure, are very aware that there are 3 cycles. It's important that you consider these cycles when you're looking at when would be best to submit your applications. And in terms of the timeline of when the review occurs, when the council is going to meet to discuss the potential funding of your application, and then what the estimated award date. And it is important that you recognize that these cycles are not equal in time length any longer, and so really consider which cycle is most appropriate and when you feel you're ready to come in with your application. Now, once submitted, as I said, your application goes to a referral officer, and these are professional scientists and most who also serve as scientific review officers themselves. They check your application to make sure it's on time, that it's been formatted correctly, and that it's complete. And then based on your ARF and or a cover letter, you can also include a cover letter, but you're requested to not make the same request. The cover letter should only cover additional items. For example, if your application is late, or for example, if you plan to submit video materials later on, they can go into a cover letter. But the ARF is going to cover things like assignments and requests for study sections. And based on those requests, that your application will be forwarded to what's called an investigational review group within a center or within institute. And as far as the CSR study sections, we have many institutional review groups within a number of divisions, and again, all that information is on the Center for Scientific Review's website to guide your requests for where you feel your application should be. And I will let you know and I think this is important that you are aware, the Center for Scientific Review will strongly consider what your requests are. And it's only if the request is not, so for example, if you make a request for a study section, you will be assigned initially to that study section. And the only reason it would not be granted that request is if the scientific review officer of that study section felt they did not have the expertise to address the topic of your application. So that's why it's so important that you determine what's most appropriate. But if you request a study section, we try very hard to honor those requests and make sure that your application is reviewed where you would like it to be reviewed. Now, in terms of the applications being assigned, as I said, the institutes and centers are responsible for funding and awards, but the IRGs, or the integrated review groups, are where the individual study sections are housed, and that's where your applications will be reviewed. Once you've been assigned, the applications are then referred, and the match in terms of the assignment is based on the research that you proposed and what the overall mission of that institute or center is. And your institute assignment can be a dual assignment if you feel there's more than one institute that can satisfy or is appropriate for the topic of your application. In terms of peer review, the CSR study sections are managed by people like myself called scientific review officers, and we have scientific backgrounds that are very close to the focus of our study section. What I will do for my particular study section, as all SROs will do, is recruit the reviewers for that study section. But I will tell you that for the SBIRs, we do not have what are called chartered members. All study section reviewers are recruited for each round of review. And so you will not have the same members serving from one study section to the next, because the reviewers I recruit are based upon the pool of applications that I receive in my study section for any given cycle. I have approximately 60 to 100 applications per cycle, and that they are referred on that cycle basis, and then each application is assigned to 3 primary reviewers. Now, my role is that I am the designated federal official that is responsible for the review. So I administratively review the applications, I select the reviewers, I assign the reviewers who have the appropriate expertise, and it may range from the basic sciences to clinical science or people in technology and industry who have commercialization expertise. It all depends on what your application requires, and that's why that ARF form is very useful, because you can say whether or not you feel you need some strong clinical input or whether you need someone with strong commercialization expertise. I also manage the actual running of the study section, and then I am the one who prepares the summary statements that you receive following the study section meeting. Now, before the meeting, I assign each application to 3 reviewers. They get their applications 5 to 6 weeks in advance of the meeting. And the reviewers assign a preliminary overall impact score that's based on the criterion score for each of the 5 core review criteria, which are significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And based on those criterion scores, they come up with an overall impact score that is not a sum of those criterion scores, but which reflects what they feel the overall impact of your application is. For each of the criteria, they list major strengths and weaknesses for all of these 5 criteria. Now, at a meeting, the order of review is determined by the preliminary overall impact score from the assigned reviewers. And based on that score, a discussion order is achieved on the basis of the average overall impact score. And then we discuss those applications in order of those preliminary overall impact scores. But we only can review approximately 50% of the scored applications. And so the cutoff for discussion is at 50% of any given cluster of applications. So for the SBIRs, the Phase 1 cluster, the top 50% of applications will be discussed, and then the Cluster 2 would be the Phase 2 and fast tracks, and the top 50% scored applications would be discussed. In terms of scoring, there's a 9-point scoring scale that is used for the core criteria and overall impact, and all applications receive these scores. The discussed applications also ultimately receive a final overall impact score. The non-discussed only receive the criterion scores from the 3 reviewers. Now, after your review, what happens? So those applications that have been discussed end up having a resume paragraph that's written by me that summarizes the discussion that occurred at the meeting by the 3 primary reviewers and the panel as a whole. And that summary basically is what has been discussed at the meetings and may or may not be reflected by the actual critiques from the primary reviewers, because sometimes points of discussion come up from non-primary reviewers, and those kinds of comments would be reflected in that resume. However, for the non-discussed applications, there will not be a resume written, and you would have just the 3 primary critiques and criterion scores from your 3 primary reviewers. And that summary statement is a very important item. It obviously gives you direct feedback from your expert reviewers, and these are essentially unedited critiques, and you are given the scores for your criteria and sometimes administrative notes if necessary. Now, remember that there is a way of checking into what the status of your application is, and that's in your ERA Commons account. And in your ERA Commons account, you can check for where your actual application has been assigned. You can check what the meeting date is. You can check who your scientific review officer is. And you can also check who your program officer is. So it's really important to remember that once you've submitted an application, you've been assigned a program officer as well as a scientific review officer. Myself, as a scientific review officer, up until the time of the review meeting, and then once the summary statement has been released, I am your primary point of contact. And if you have questions, you can contact me, but you can also contact your program officer. But once the review is over and the summary statement has been released, your primary contact person is now your program officer, because they know what's going to happen to your application now that it's been referred out of the Center for Scientific Review and has gone to the Institute, whether it be NHLBI, General Medicine, Diabetes and Digestive, whichever institute it's been assigned to. So remember what that distinction is, and you can always find that information in your Commons account. Now, these are just some links at the CSR website, resources for applicants, study section descriptions, and where you can find roster and meeting dates as well. And please use our resources. We do our very best to keep them updated on a regular basis, and there's a wealth of information for applicants and for small business companies to be able to find the information that you're looking for. But then you can always contact your institute or your scientific review officer once your application is here in the Center for Scientific Review.
Great. So we're going to answer a few questions first. That was a great overview, and we've gotten a lot of questions. So we'll answer a few of the questions first, and then we'll move on to Dr. Kristen Goltry's presentation about NHLBI. So the first question was, how do I become a reviewer? And so I mentioned it briefly and included a link on the CSR website on how do you become a reviewer. But essentially it involves, well, I don't know if, Margie, if you would like to say, how do you become a reviewer for CSR?
So there's different processes depending on the types of applications that you have. And obviously for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to speak strictly to the SBIRs. There is actually no official process to apply to be a reviewer. We do have a process, an early career reviewer process in the Center for Scientific Review, but most of those are relevant to the R01, R21 type applications. But if you're interested in becoming a reviewer, you can either contact your program officer at the institute level to indicate that interest and say who should you contact, and they could refer you to the relevant study section SRO if you haven't actually had an application there. Or if you've had an application, for example, in my study section, I have had reviewers who have subsequently contacted me and said, I'd be very interested in review and I would like to be considered as a reviewer. And then what I will do is I will look at your biosketch, I will look at your experiences and what your expertise is, and anyone is eligible for consideration. There are no eligibility criteria necessarily to be a reviewer, except obviously you must have some experience in the field, you must have some expertise in a particular area, and hopefully, presumably, you will have had expertise through making your own applications and or running your own small business. But in terms of actual criteria, no, there's no actual specific criteria to become a reviewer. And
maybe Kristen will address some of this during her presentation about for NHLBI if you wanted to become a reviewer. So another question is, how do I identify conflicts if I don't know who the reviewers are?
So that's always a difficult topic. Technically, you should be only identifying conflicts based upon the area of the particular area that your technology is in. If you know of specific companies, for example, that are directly competing, that are producing competitive technologies, then you can identify those companies and relevant people who are working at those companies. You can, if you're an STTR applicant and you're associated with an academic institution and you know that you have some competitors at other academic institutions who are doing similar work, you can identify competitors based upon the areas of research. But it's very difficult to identify specific individuals just because you may potentially have had a disagreement with that person at a meeting, or may have had a disagreement with that person at a professional society or some other mechanism. We ask that you clearly identify what the source of conflict is, and not just say that this person should be in conflict. We need a rationale for the conflict, and if they are dealing with competitive technologies, we will respect those requests as much as is possible. But you do have to understand that until we have a pool of applications, we can't select the reviewers, so we don't know what areas of expertise we need. So it's very difficult to predict who is going to be on a panel.
So then, somewhat related, if they see that there's a competitor on the roster before the review happens, can they request that person be removed, or how should they deal with that?
So first of all, the roster is not identified until 30 days before the meeting, and at that point, the panel has been recruited and the assignments have been made. If you see the roster and find that you have a major concern about a possible competitor, after the fact, after the assignment has been made, you can send that information to your scientific review officer. But that is the real reason that assignment request form has come up, so that you can identify potential conflicts before the assignments are ever made. Because once an assignment is made, it's incredibly difficult to alter those requests, although not impossible. And it has occurred where we have put a reviewer in conflict after an assignment has been made. But that's why it's incumbent upon you, the applicant, to make that request in your ARF when you submit your application, because you know who your competitors are.
So there have been a few questions about the ARF form, and so I'll just answer those. So where do you find that? That's actually in the new NIH SF 424 forms version D. So that is a new form in the new version of the application, and it can be used in the different submission methods. So if you do the downloadable PDF, if you use the assist mechanism, for example. So why don't we move on now next to presentation from Dr. Kristen Goldtree.
Okay. Hi, I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about what we're doing at the NHLBI Office of Scientific Review to help support SBIR review process. Now, if I can figure out how to move my slides. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so some of this may be repetitive, but then I'll be adding some specific things for NHLBI. So there are many institutes and centers here at NIH that have their own offices of scientific review with their own scientific review officers, and these are distinct from CSR. And for the NHLBI Office of Scientific Review, for example, we review any program project grants that come to our office. We review the training grants that we have for NHLBI, and more importantly, for the SBIR mechanism, we review the applications that are received in response to our funding opportunity announcements. And those can be requests for applications, RFAs, which would be SBIR grants or STTR grants, and requests for proposals, which would be your contracts. And so those are typically reviewed within our own Office of Scientific Review. So this slide, I've kind of split up into two groups, the NHLBI SBIR STTR program. And so I've split it up into where the applications are coming from and who's reviewing them. And so as Dr. Chandler just mentioned, if applications are received in response to the omnibus solicitation that NIH puts out, so those are the investigator-initiated applications. Those are typically reviewed in CSR at the study sections that she mentioned. And once that review has happened, then it comes into our institute and goes to the Advisory Council for funding decisions. And as an example, the last fiscal year, approximately 75% of our SBIR STTR budget went to those types of applications. And so within NHLBI, we have another pathway where we develop our own funding opportunity announcements based on a specific scientific interest or a need that we've identified. And those, once we put out that FOA, we receive applications in response to that, and those go to within our own Office of Scientific Review for peer review. And then the results of that then go to Advisory Council and funding decisions. And approximately 25% of our budget went to those types of applications in the last fiscal year. And so I'll just go over more specifically. We want to talk about the development of funding opportunity announcements, because that's really what we consider the beginning of the review process. And we consider that the beginning of the review process because the criteria that the reviewers are going to be evaluated are determined within that funding opportunity announcement. And with these criteria, it also defines the expertise that we need on our panels. And so for our institute funding opportunity announcements, or RFAs, we have the opportunity to define these criteria, whereas for the NIH-wide omnibus solicitations, we do not. And so this is just an example, of course, of the criteria that we can and have been including in our specific small business funding opportunity announcements. And that includes evaluation of the science, but also including specific criteria including product and process development, regulatory issues, commercial potential, especially if they're for phase 2 applications. And these criteria are specifically laid out in the RFA, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, specifically in Section 5, the application review information, especially for an institute-centered FOA. That's where there will be specific criteria that you'll want to pay attention to. And these criteria will be evaluated by the reviewers and lead to your funding decisions. And these are just examples that I wanted to show of what is found in the NIH-wide omnibus solicitation for SBIRs. The only criteria that's related to commercial potential is found with a series of other questions under the significance, where it says, does the proposed project have commercial potential to lead to a marketable product? And that is the only question that the reviewers consider, and it becomes part of the significance criterion score and can factor into your overall score. Whereas down below is an example of some additional review criteria that we've added to those omnibus criteria for a specific RFA, and because we had more interest in understanding the market needs and commercial success. So we added some extra questions. Is there a clear need and window of opportunity within a specific market, et cetera? And these questions are specifically called out in the critique template that the reviewers use, and they will have specific comments that are addressed by the reviewers. And so we're trying to get more in-depth details related to these topics in our critiques, and hoping, of course, that that would lead to better funding decisions. Another thing that we've been doing recently at the NHLBI is looking at, of course, the reviewer expertise in recruitment. Typically for research applications, we look for scientific researchers, medical professionals, and there's typically been from research universities. And we're using NIH databases, looking at grant recipients, looking at scientific publications to recruit these types of individuals. But we're also spending a lot of time looking at people with expertise in business and commercial potential, looking at people with expertise in regulatory. And so we've been branching out and looking at different other sources of reviewers, including entrepreneurial or innovation centers, which are oftentimes associated with universities, technology transfer offices. We've been looking at venture capital firms, and we've also been looking at small businesses as sources of reviewers. And so we're developing a really nice database that includes a lot of different expertise like this that will help us get a well-rounded panel for review of these applications. And once we have found the appropriate expertise, and a lot of these reviewers haven't reviewed in the past, and so we have a strong program to educate and support our reviewers. We do pre-meeting reviewer orientations where we talk about the program, the RFA that was put out, and what the goals of it are. We talk about the mechanism of the application, whether it's SBI or STTR, and make sure there's a good understanding of that. And we also discuss all of the specific review criteria that were laid out in the RFA. And in addition to talking with the reviewers and supporting them that way, we modify our critique templates. And each one is modified to match the review criteria that are listed in the RFA. So on the critique templates themselves, they will see each of the criteria that's listed in the RFA and be able to address them. And so hopefully we'll get a very nice, robust critique from the reviewers. And so just to conclude, within the NHLBI, we're enhancing the review criteria that we list in the FOA to try and get a better handle on some of the issues that will help us make funding decisions. We also convene a panel with specific expertise related to those enhanced review criteria. We educate and support our reviewers, and we provide them with specific critique templates. And all of that will hopefully lead to some really good funding decisions and success in our program. And that's about all I wanted to say from our side of things.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to switch over to, you can go to the next slide. Great. So again, our little disclaimer about these Hangouts being educational only, and feel free to contact us because I know there were a number of questions related to more general application advice, and so we're going to not have time to discuss all of those today, but I encourage you to reach out to us or to the appropriate institute contact. And so again, please do feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I'm going to leave this slide up there with our contact information and additional links to see the other Hangouts. But what we're going to do now is switch over to just the Q&A. Yes, okay. So hopefully you're able to see Dr. Chandler and Dr. Goltry, and we'll move on to answering questions now. So
can I add a little something to the one before I give my little spiel too? Because I wanted people to understand that when you're looking at a roster, that doesn't necessarily mean that the reviewer is assigned to your specific application. And so if you find somebody on a roster that you feel is in conflict with your application, they can still stay on the roster. They just may remove themselves from the room during the discussion of your application. And so I'm not quite sure if that came through. And so you can let people know to make sure that if you see a conflict that it has been taken care of, but just because someone's on the roster doesn't mean that there's a problem necessarily.
And that's actually really important to clarify. So when application pool is assigned to my study section and I recruit reviewers, the first thing I do is send the whole list of key personnel for all of the applications to all of the reviewers. And they are supposed to identify any application that they feel they're in conflict with. And they are asked to identify it not just in that maybe they collaborated with any of the key personnel, but also in terms of are they in any way a competitor. And so a lot of those have already been taken into consideration. And so, for example, we have what's called an out-of-the-meeting conflict. If one of my reviewers turns out to be listed on an application, anywhere in that application, they are actually going to be off the roster. But if they are just in conflict with one particular application, then they are what is called an out-of-the-room conflict. And so when that application is discussed, they will leave the room for the discussion. And if, for any instance, that application doesn't happen to be discussed, they would not be privy to any of the information of that application and the critiques.
And actually, that's a good segue to talk about some of the concerns that applicants raise around confidentiality and the intellectual property that they may be disclosing in their applications. So I think the specific question is really about, do the reviewers, for example, keep a copy of the application? How is confidentiality maintained?
Each of the reviewers, even before they see the list of applications, would sign a confidentiality agreement. And we, of course, have to trust that they will be bound by that confidentiality agreement. They are not supposed to keep any of the documents that are related to the review once the review is over. And again, we're trusting that they're doing what they're supposed to do. They also sign pre-meeting and post-meeting conflict of interest forms to verify that what their conflicts of interest were in the meeting. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Exactly the same in CSR. Pre-meeting and post-meeting conflicts of interest are signed, the reviewers can't actually see your applications until they've signed a confidentiality agreement, and then we request that they keep copies of their critiques for 30 days after the meeting, at which point all summary statements, certainly for CSR, must be released 30 days after the meeting. And at that point, they are required to destroy all electronic and paper copies of any of the materials from those applications.
Great, thank you. So there are a few, kind of going back to the beginning, when applications are assigned to multiple institutes, what exactly is the role of these different institute assignments, and does the primary IC matter more?
Well, the primary IC is the one that has the first opportunity to fund it if they're interested. And if they are not interested, then it goes to the second one. I actually, in my days, had a primary assignment to NHLBI and a secondary to NIDDK. And NHLBI wasn't sure what their funding level was going to be. And so I called up NIDDK, the program officer there, and asked if they would be interested, and they actually had the money and they knew that they wanted it, so it got transferred over to that institute. So you are able to talk to the multiple institutes, and if one is not interested and the other is, you can get it funded through there. So my take home from that is call them, talk to them. People are always willing to talk, and finagle it around, see what you can find. I've had some come back from a colleague of mine 6 months later, and the Nursing Institute decided they wanted it because they had some money. Especially with the SBIR program, there's a set amount that you have to spend. And if some institutes did not get what they consider competitive applications, they may be stuck with money. And so you can actually see, is there an institute that might be interested that has money that could do it? So I would contact everybody and everyone on your list.
So are 100% of the reviewers on an SBIR study section new for each cycle, or do some of them carry over from previous cycles?
That would be more new.
Yeah, so no. What ends up happening is, based upon the pool of applications, my expertise requirements can change dramatically from one cycle to the next. I may have a lot more applications that are dealing with heart failure, or a lot more that are dealing with arrhythmias, or a lot more that are device developments as opposed to pharmacological new products, or maybe a point-of-care instrument. So yes, to a certain extent there is a new batch who will come on each time, but there are certain reviewers who, based upon their expertise and their backgrounds, are very capable of reviewing a broad base of applications. And so we often will have potentially 20 to 25% of the panel members who may repeat from one cycle to the next. Also, from the applicant perspective, I think you might like to hear that there is some repeat, because obviously if you submit an A0 and get 3 critiques, I think most applicants would like to believe that at least one of those reviewers will be reviewing the A1, so that there's some continuity, and that they will be aware that you have clearly addressed the concerns that were raised on the A0. So we try to get some repeats, but it's never more than probably 65, 70% of the reviewers who repeat from cycle to cycle.
And what is the overall fraction of reviewers that you would say comes from a more traditional academic research institution rather than some of the other types of entities, like from industry? So
the recommendation that we receive at CSR is that we should have at least a third of our reviewers either come directly from companies, industry, or who have academic/industry backgrounds. So it's usually at least a third of the reviewers who have direct SBIR, STTR experience.
And for NHLBI, it's really dependent on the RFA. And I've had some RFAs where I've had nobody with, as far as research scientific, because it was all developing centers and hubs and commercialization potential and things like that. So it really just depends on the RFA from our viewpoint.
And then there was a question, and you've somewhat addressed it, but does NHLBI only have a single SBIR study section?
Well, we don't have study sections. Every RFA gets a brand new panel, and we call it a special emphasis panel as well, but it really there are different panels for each of the RFAs, and so we don't have any standing SBIR study sections at this time.
Whereas CSR, we do have regular standing, what we call recurring special emphasis panels. So all of the CSR, SBIR, STTR study sections are the same from one cycle to the next.
So we only have we're in our last minute, and so I know we didn't get to, here, I'll come stand over here. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. Sorry about that, but we will try to answer them individually. But again, feel free to submit your inquiries to the NHLBI Small Biz Inquiry Form if it's a question for NHLBI, if you're in our mission space. If you have questions especially about applying to the SBIR, STTR program for NHLBI, definitely reach out to us there. And if not, you can look at the sbir.nih.gov website, where it lists all of the Institute contacts. And thank you again, both Dr. Chandler and Dr. Goldtree, for such a fantastic presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.